Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Perfect Facade. Clay Collins stood in his kitchen, methodically cleaning his Sig Sauer P226 while his wife Carla prepared breakfast. To any observer, they were the picture of suburban bliss, a decorated Delta Force operator and his beautiful wife of 12 years, living in their pristine two-story home in Virginia Beach. But Clay's trained eyes noticed things others missed. The way Carla's hands trembled slightly as she cracked eggs, how she avoided his gaze when discussing her book club meetings, the fresh hickey on her neck that she'd tried to cover with concealer. Clay had returned from his deployment in Somalia 3 weeks ago, expecting the usual homecoming routine. Instead, he found a wife who flinched at his touch and made excuses to leave the house. 20 years of military service, 8 of them in Delta Force, had taught him to read people like open books. Carla was lying about something big. "I might be late tonight," Carla said, not looking up from the stove. "Book club is discussing that new thriller everyone's talking about." Clay's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He'd followed her last week. There was no book club. Instead, she'd driven to the Marriott downtown, where she'd spent 3 hours in room 817 with Drew Jenkins, a local contractor who'd been renovating houses in their neighborhood. What Clay found particularly interesting was that Drew had a history of targeting military wives during deployments, a pattern Clay had uncovered during his own reconnaissance. "Which thriller?" Clay asked casually, reassembling his weapon with practiced efficiency. Carla's shoulders tensed. I can't remember the title. Something about murder." Clay almost smiled. If she only knew how prophetic that was. That evening, while Carla was at her supposed book club, Clay broke into Drew Jenkins' home. Years of covert operations had made him a ghost. He could enter and exit without leaving a trace. In Drew's bedroom closet, hidden behind loose drywall, Clay found something that made his blood turn to ice. Detailed photographs of their house, floor plans, security system codes, and most damning of all, a life insurance policy on Clay worth $2 million that Carla had taken out 6 months ago. But the real revelation came from Drew's laptop. Clay discovered encrypted files detailing a plan that went far beyond simple adultery. Drew had convinced Carla that Clay was becoming suspicious and might discover her infidelity. The solution? Make Clay's death look like a home invasion gone wrong. Drew had connections with criminal elements who could make it happen for the right price, a price that would be paid from Clay's life insurance. Clay photographed everything, his military training, keeping his emotions in check, even his rage built in his chest. His wife wasn't just cheating, she was planning his murder. The woman he'd trusted with his life, who'd held him through nightmares from Afghanistan and Somalia, was conspiring to end his existence for money in another man's bed. As Clay left Drew's house, he began formulating his response. In Delta Force, they had a saying, "The enemy gets a vote, but they don't get the last vote." Carla and Drew had made their move. Now it was Clay's turn. Chapter 2. The Hunter's Patience. Clay spent the next week maintaining the illusion of normalcy while conducting surveillance on his wife and her lover. His Delta Force training in psychological operations proved invaluable. He became the perfect, unsuspecting husband, bringing Carla flowers, planning a romantic weekend getaway, even discussing their future together. All the while, he was documenting their every move, their communications, their weaknesses. Through his contacts in military intelligence, Clay learned more about Drew Jenkins. The man was a predator who'd done this before, targeting military wives during deployments, convincing them their husbands were threats, then arranging accidents to collect insurance money. 2 previous wives had died under suspicious circumstances, but Drew had been careful enough to avoid prosecution. He was good at his game, but he'd never faced someone like Clay Collins. Carla, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly nervous. She caught Clay watching her during phone calls, noticed how he'd changed his routines, started locking his office door. During one of their intimate moments that now felt like poison to Clay, she tried to probe about his work, asking about his security clearances, his access to weapons, whether anyone would notice if he went missing. "Why would you ask something like that?" Clay had responded, watching her face carefully. "Just worried about you," she'd said, but her eyes told a different story. Some of the wives at book club, mentioned their husbands dealing with dangerous people overseas. I just want to make sure you're safe. Clay knew she was reporting back to Drew, helping him refine their murder plan. That night, he installed micro cameras throughout the house, turning their home into a surveillance network. If they were going to move against him, he'd have evidence of everything. The breakthrough came when Clay intercepted a text conversation between Carla and Drew discussing the timeline. Drew had contacted a crew, 3 men from Baltimore with extensive criminal records who specialized in home invasions that ended in murder. The plan was simple. Clay would be killed during what appeared to be a robbery. Carla would play the traumatized widow, and after a respectable mourning period, she and Drew would disappear with the insurance money. But Clay discovered something else in Drew's communications that changed everything. Drew wasn't planning to let Carla live either. Once the insurance money was collected, he intended to eliminate her too, making it look like she'd been killed by the same criminal elements that had murdered her husband. Drew Jenkins was playing a deeper game than Carla realized. She was just another mark, another greedy wife who'd signed her own death warrant. Clay felt no pity for his wife, only a cold satisfaction that her betrayal would ultimately destroy her. But first, he needed to send a message that would echo through every criminal network in the region. In Delta Force, they didn't just neutralize threats, they made examples of them. That night, Clay began preparing his counterstrike. He requisitioned equipment through black market contacts, reached out to former Delta teammates who owed him favors, and started crafting a trap that would turn Drew's own plan against him. If they wanted to play with death, Clay would show them what a real killer looked like. Chapter 3. Setting the Trap. Clay's plan required precise timing and his wife's unwitting cooperation. He began feeding Carla false information about his schedule, telling her he'd been assigned to a classified operation that would take him out of town for several days. He watched her excitement barely concealed behind concerned wife act, knowing she was already texting Drew about the opportunity. Meanwhile, Clay was setting up his own network. He reached out to Hector Haas and Gregory Lyons, 2 former Delta operators who now work private security. Both men had been with Clay during the bloodiest operations in Afghanistan and trusted him completely. Clay didn't tell them about Carla's betrayal. He simply said he'd uncovered a plot against his life and needed backup for a defensive operation. How many targets? Hector asked during their clandestine meeting at a warehouse outside Norfolk. 3 shooters plus 2 principals, Clay replied, spreading surveillance photos across a metal table. The principals think they're running the show, but they're about to learn otherwise. Gregory studied the photos of Drew Jenkins and the 3 Baltimore criminals. You want them dead or just neutralized? Clay's smile was arctic. I want them to understand the difference between a mark and a predator. The beauty of Clay's trap lay in its simplicity. He would appear to leave for his fictional assignment, but actually remain hidden in the house, armed and ready. When the hit team arrived, expecting to find an empty home and a defenseless wife, they'd instead face a Delta Force operator on his own terrain. But Clay added a twist that Drew's criminal mind couldn't anticipate. Through his intelligence contacts, Clay leaked information suggesting that Drew Jenkins was actually an undercover federal agent targeting organized crime. The leak was subtle, designed to reach the Baltimore crew just before they executed their plan. Clay wanted them paranoid, suspicious, and ready to turn on each other at the first sign of trouble. 2 days before the plan hit, Clay intercepted another text conversation that confirmed everything. Carla had told Drew that Clay would be leaving Thursday night and wouldn't return until Monday. The hit team would strike Friday evening, when neighbors would assume any sounds came from Carla's book club gathering. Thursday evening, Clay staged his departure, loading his truck with military duffel bags and driving away while Carla watched from the window. He circled back through the woods behind their property and entered through a basement access tunnel he'd dug years earlier during his paranoid post-deployment phase. Carla never knew it existed. From his hidden position in the house's surveillance room, a panic room he'd built but never told Carla about, Clay watched his wife transform from grieving military spouse to excited conspirator. She spent hours on the phone with Drew, confirming details, practicing her story for the police, even picking out a black dress for Clay's funeral. Friday afternoon, Drew arrived to comfort Carla and discuss final details. Clay listened through his surveillance system as they reviewed the plan. The hit team would enter through the back door at 9 p.m., stage a robbery, kill Carla after forcing her to reveal where Clay kept his valuables, then disappear. Drew would have an alibi at a bar across town, and Carla would be found dead the next morning by concerned neighbors. "You sure about this?" Drew asked Carla as they sat in Clay's living room. "Once this starts, there's no going back." Carla's response chilled Clay to the bone. "He's been suspicious lately. I think he knows about us. Better to end this now, before he can ruin everything we've planned." Clay checked his weapons one final time. His wife and her lover had just confirmed they deserved everything that was coming to them. In a few hours, they would learn that betraying a Delta Force operator carried a price measured in blood. Chapter 4. The Wolves Arrive. At 8:47 p.m., Clay's perimeter sensors detected 3 vehicles approaching through the woods behind his property. The Baltimore crew had arrived early, professional enough to scout the area before their main assault. Through thermal imaging, Clay tracked their movements as they positioned themselves around the house, identifying entry points and escape routes. The 3 men were exactly what Clay expected from Drew's criminal contacts. Ryan Tuttle, a career burglar with a fondness for violence. Carl Cobb, a former gang enforcer who'd graduated to contract killing. And Pablo Foster, a drug dealer who specialized in making murders look like robberies. All 3 had extensive records and no moral compass. Perfect tools for Drew's scheme. Inside the house, Drew was getting Carla into position. Clay watched through hidden cameras as Drew produced zip ties and a ball gag from his jacket. "We need to make this look real," he explained to a suddenly nervous Carla. "You'll be tied up, roughed up a little, but alive when they're finished." But Clay could see Drew palming a knife, and his surveillance equipment picked up the text Drew sent to his accomplice outside. "Change of plans. Kill them both. Make it look like torture gone wrong." Carla still believed she would survive this night. She had no idea that Drew had always planned to eliminate her, just as she'd planned to eliminate Clay. The irony would have been amusing if Clay felt anything beyond cold fury. At exactly 9 p.m., Ryan Tuttle picked the back door lock with practiced ease. The 3 men entered Clay's home like predators stalking prey, weapons drawn, moving with the coordination of experienced criminals. They expected to find a helpless woman in an empty house. Instead, they found themselves in a perfectly designed kill zone. Clay had spent years learning to hunt the most dangerous prey on Earth. Terrorists, war criminals, enemy operatives who would kill him without hesitation. These 3 criminals were kindergarten compared to what he'd faced in Somalia and Afghanistan. The first indication something was wrong came when Carl Cobb reached for the living room light switch and triggered Clay's first trap. A pressure plate activated an improvised explosive device that sent ball bearings through Carl's legs, dropping him screaming to the floor. The explosion also triggered magnetic locks throughout the house, sealing all exits. "What the hell?" Ryan Tuttle spun toward the sound, his pistol extended, just as Clay's second trap activated. Motion sensors triggered strobe lights and a deafening siren, disorienting the intruders while Clay moved through the house using routes they couldn't see. Pablo Foster, the smartest of the 3, immediately understood they'd walked into an ambush. "This is a setup," he screamed over the sirens. "Someone knows we're here." Drew's voice carried from the living room, panicked and confused. "What's happening?" This wasn't supposed to. His words were cut off by the sound of Clay's footsteps on the stairs. The Delta operator emerged from the shadows like death itself, wearing full tactical gear and carrying an M4 carbine. His face was painted black, his movements were fluid and predatory, and his eyes held the flat emptiness of a man who'd killed so many times that taking life required no more emotion than breathing. "Good evening, gentlemen," Clay said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Welcome to my home." Chapter 5. The Predator Revealed. Ryan Tuttle, despite his criminal experience, had never faced anyone like Clay Collins. He raised his pistol toward the figure on the stairs, but Clay was already moving, years of CQB training making him a blur of lethal efficiency. Clay's first burst from the M4 took Ryan's center mass, the 5.56 rounds punching through his chest and spraying blood across Carla's white living room walls. Pablo Foster, seeing his partner die, made the mistake of trying to run. Clay's second burst caught him in the back as he reached for a window, the round shattering his spine and dropping him face first in a broken glass. Pablo screamed once, then began the wet, labored breathing of a man drowning in his own blood. Carl Cobb, still conscious despite his shattered legs, tried to crawl toward his dropped weapon. Clay walked down the stairs with deliberate calm, ejected his magazine, inserted a fresh one, and put a single round through Carl's reaching hand. The criminal's fingers disappeared in a spray of bone and blood. "Please," Carl gasped. "We didn't know. Drew said this was just some soldier's wife." "Drew lied," Clay replied, his voice conversational. "He does that a lot." In the living room, Carla sat frozen in horror, still zip-tied to the chair, but now covered in blood spatter from Ryan's death. Drew stood behind her, his knife pressed to her throat, his face a mask of panic and calculation. "Stay back," Drew shouted. "I'll kill her. I swear I'll." Clay's laugh was a sound from hell itself. "Go ahead. Save me the trouble." The casual cruelty of Clay's response broke something in Carla's mind. She began hyperventilating, the reality of her situation finally penetrating her consciousness. She wasn't the mastermind of this plan. She was just another victim, a pawn to be discarded when she'd served her purpose. "You don't mean that," Drew said, but his voice wavered. "She's your wife. You love her." Clay moved closer, the M4 trained on Drew's head. "I loved her. Past tense. The moment she decided to have me killed, she became just another target." Drew's knife hand shook. "The money, we can split the insurance money. $2 million, tax-free. We can all walk away from this." "The only place you're walking is to hell," Clay replied. He looked down at Carl Cobb, who was still conscious despite the blood loss. "Tell me about the others you've killed for Drew. How many military wives didn't survive your visits?" Carl's voice was barely a whisper. 4, maybe 5. Drew finds them, convinces them their husbands are dangerous, sets up the hits. Clay nodded, confirming what he'd suspected. Drew Jenkins wasn't just a two-bit criminal. He was a serial killer who specialized in targeting military families. The insurance money was just a bonus. Drew enjoyed the power of convincing wives to betray their husbands, then watching them die for their betrayal. "Carla," Clay said, his voice gentle for the first time since the shooting started. "Look at me." His wife's terrified eyes met his through her tears. Clay saw no remorse there, only fear for her own life. Even now, faced with the consequences of her choices, she felt no guilt for planning his murder. "Did you really think a Delta Force operator who's hunted men like them would fall for your cheap trick?" Clay asked, his voice dropping to a whisper of death. "You were wrong, but your betrayal will be your last meal." Drew's knife pressed deeper into Carla's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "Let us go, or she dies right now." Clay's response was a single, perfectly placed shot that removed the top of Drew's skull. The contractor's body crumpled behind Carla's chair, his blood painting the wall in abstract patterns. Carla's screams echoed through the house as Drew's corpse twitched at her feet. Chapter 6, The Final Accounting. Clay walked through his blood-soaked living room with the methodical precision of a crime scene investigator, checking each body to ensure there were no survivors who might later testify about what had happened. Carl Cobb was still alive, but fading fast, his breathing shallow and irregular. Pablo Foster had stopped moving entirely, his body twisted at an unnatural angle among the shattered glass. Carla sat in shocked silence, her earlier screams replaced by the vacant stare of someone whose mind had simply shut down. Blood from Drew's corpse had pooled around her chair, and she seemed unaware that she was sitting in her lover's brain matter. "Carla," Clay said, pulling up a chair to sit directly in front of his wife. "We need to talk." She didn't respond, didn't even seem to recognize his voice. Clay reached out and turned her face toward his, noting how she flinched at his touch. The same touch she'd welcomed for 12 years of marriage. "I said we need to talk." His voice carried the command authority that had sent soldiers into battle across 3 continents. Carla's eyes focused on his face, though they remained glassy with shock. "Why?" she whispered. Why did you do this to me? Clay's laugh was bitter. Why did to you? Carla, you planned to have me murdered. You took out a life insurance policy without my knowledge, gave a stranger the blueprints to our home, and scheduled my execution. What I did was defend myself. Carla's expression shifted, some cunning returning to her features. You can't prove that. There's no evidence. Clay held up Drew's phone, which he'd retrieved from the corpse. Everything's here. Text messages, photos, financial records, contact information for the hit team. You documented your entire conspiracy to commit murder. The blood drained from Carla's face as she realized the magnitude of her situation. Even if she survived this night, her own electronic communications would send her to death row. I can also prove that Drew was planning to kill you after my death, Clay continued. You weren't his partner, Carla. You were just another victim waiting to happen. He's done this before. 4 other military wives died because they trusted him the way you did. Carl Cobb made a wet, gasping sound from across the room. Clay glanced over to see the criminal, trying to speak, blood frothing from his lips. Clay walked over and knelt beside him. Got something to say before you die? Drew. Drew said you'd never see it coming, Carl wheezed. Said you were just another stupid soldier, too trusting to survive. He was wrong about that. Yeah, he was. Clay stood up and walked back to Carla. The interesting thing is, you could have just asked for a divorce. I would have given you half of everything and walked away. Instead, you chose murder. Carla's voice was barely audible. I loved him. No, you loved the idea of him. The excitement, the money, the new life he promised you. But you never loved him enough to actually leave me and start over honestly. You wanted everything. My death, my money, and your lover. That kind of greed always destroys the people who embrace it. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of sirens. Clay had triggered silent alarms that would bring police and federal agents to investigate the home invasion. He had 15 minutes to finish his work and prepare his story. Here's what's going to happen, Clay told his wife. The police will find evidence of a conspiracy to commit murder, led by Drew Jenkins and executed by a crew of criminals from Baltimore. You'll be arrested as a co-conspirator and charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. With Drew's communications as evidence, you'll likely get the death penalty. Carla began crying again, but Clay felt no sympathy. I could have saved you from that fate, but you made your choice when you decided I was worth more dead than alive. Clay cut the zip ties holding Carla to the chair and stepped back. When the police arrive, you're going to tell them exactly what happened here tonight. You're going to admit to the conspiracy, explain how Drew manipulated you, and throw yourself on the mercy of the court. Maybe they'll give you life in prison instead of the needle. The sirens were getting closer. Clay began staging the scene, placing weapons near the dead criminal's hands, scattering fake valuables around the room to support the home invasion narrative. To any investigator, it would look like a robbery gone wrong when the homeowner returned unexpectedly and defended his property. As blue and red lights flashed through the windows, Clay looked at his wife one final time. Carla Collins had chosen betrayal over loyalty, murder over divorce, and greed over love. Now she would spend the rest of her abbreviated life paying for those choices. The woman who had shared his bed, his hopes, and his secrets was already dead to him. The person sitting in that bloody chair was just a stranger who happened to share his name. Chapter 7. When the police burst in. The first officers through Clay's front door found a scene from a horror movie. 3 bodies lay sprawled across the living room in expanding pools of blood, while Carla Collins sat in a chair in the center of the carnage, staring at nothing. Clay emerged from the kitchen, his hands raised, still wearing tactical gear, but with his weapons secured. I'm Clay Collins, the homeowner, he announced in a calm, clear voice. These men broke into my house and threatened my wife. I defended my property. Detective Anthony Woods, a 20-year veteran of the Virginia Beach Police Department, had seen plenty of home invasions gone wrong, but nothing quite like this. The precision of the kills, the tactical efficiency of the response, and the fact that Clay Collins had managed to eliminate 3 armed criminals without suffering a scratch suggested this was no ordinary homeowner. Mr. Collins, I need you to lower your hands slowly and step away from your wife, Woods said, noting how Carla hadn't even acknowledged the police presence. Clay complied, moving with the fluid grace that marked him as former military. "Detective, you'll find evidence of a conspiracy to commit murder in the deceased's phones and computers. My wife was coerced into participating in a plot to have me killed for life insurance money." Woods looked at Carla, who was still staring at Drew's corpse. "Ma'am? Mrs. Collins? Can you hear me?" Carla's head turned slowly toward the detective, her eyes struggling to focus. "They were going to kill me too," she whispered. "Drew said we'd run away together, but he was going to kill me too." "Who's Drew, ma'am?" Clay answered. "Drew Jenkins, the contractor. He's the one who organized this. You'll find his body behind my wife's chair." Detective Woods called for the crime scene unit and additional investigators. Within an hour, Clay's house was swarming with police, federal agents, and forensic specialists. The evidence they uncovered painted a clear picture of a conspiracy that went far beyond a simple home invasion. Drew's phone contained months of communications detailing the murder plot, including financial arrangements with the Baltimore crew and insurance information on Clay. More damning were the messages between Drew and Carla, showing her enthusiastic participation in planning her husband's death. Federal agent Nicholas Brady, called in due to the interstate nature of the conspiracy, interviewed Clay in his kitchen while crime scene technicians processed the living room. Clay's story was straightforward. He'd discovered the plot through surveillance, prepared a defensive response, and eliminated the threat when the criminals entered his home. "Mr. Collins, your response was remarkably efficient," Brady observed. "Most homeowners don't neutralize 3 armed attackers without taking casualties." Clay's smile was tight. "Most homeowners aren't Delta Force operators with 20 years of combat experience. Why didn't you contact law enforcement when you discovered the plot?" "I tried to gather evidence first. I wanted to make sure everyone involved was identified and prosecuted. If I called too early, some conspirators might have escaped justice." Brady nodded, though his expression suggested he suspected there was more to the story. Clay's defensive response had been too thorough, too professionally executed. This felt less like a homeowner defending his property and more like a special operations mission. In the living room, Carla was finally talking to investigators, her shock giving way to desperate cooperation. She admitted to the conspiracy, threw Drew Jenkins under the bus, and begged for protection for what she claimed was Drew's manipulation and coercion. "He said my husband was becoming suspicious, that Clay would kill me if he found out about our affair," Carla told Detective Woods. "Drew convinced me that we had to strike first or I'd end up dead." What Carla didn't tell the investigators was how eagerly she'd participated in planning Clay's murder, how she'd suggested ways to make his death more convincing, how she'd fantasized about collecting the insurance money and starting a new life. Those details would come out during her trial, when prosecutors presented Drew's phone records showing Carla's enthusiastic participation in the murder conspiracy. As dawn broke over Virginia Beach, Clay Collins was cleared of any wrongdoing in the deaths of 3 home invaders. Carla Collins was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, a capital offense in Virginia. Drew Jenkins' conspiracy network began unraveling as federal agents traced his connections to other similar crimes across the Southeast. Clay stood on his front porch, watching as police cars and federal vehicles departed his neighborhood. His house would need extensive cleaning and renovation, but he owned it free and clear. Carla's life insurance policy would be voided due to her criminal conviction, but Clay didn't need the money. What he needed was closure, and that would come when his wife faced trial for attempting to orchestrate his murder. Chapter 8: Justice and Aftermath. 6 months later, Clay sat in the gallery of the Virginia Beach Circuit Court, watching as prosecutor Catherine Wu presented the state's case against his former wife. Carla had aged dramatically during her time in custody. Her hair had gone gray, her face was gaunt, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Drew's phone contained hundreds of text messages showing Carla's active participation in planning Clay's murder. She'd suggested the fake robbery scenario, helped scout the house for entry points, and even picked out the dress she planned to wear to Clay's funeral. Most damning were audio recordings Drew had made of their conversations, insurance against potential betrayal that became evidence of Carla's guilt. The defendant didn't just agree to her husband's murder, Wu told the jury. She helped design it. She provided blueprints of their home, schedules of her husband's movements, and details about their security systems. This wasn't a woman coerced by an abusive lover. This was a willing conspirator who stood to profit from her husband's death. Carla's defense attorney, Herman Reyes, tried to paint her as a victim of Drew's manipulation, a grieving widow who'd been seduced and controlled by a master manipulator. But the evidence told a different story. Drew's other victims had been genuinely coerced through threats and blackmail. Carla had been motivated by greed and lust, not fear. On the third day of trial, Carla took the stand in her own defense. Clay watched as she attempted to portray herself as an innocent wife who'd been manipulated by a sophisticated criminal. Her performance was convincing to some. Tears flowed on cue. Her voice trembled with apparent remorse, and she claimed to have loved Clay despite planning his murder. But Prosecutor Wu was ready for her. During cross-examination, she presented phone records showing Carla had been researching Clay's life insurance policies months before meeting Drew. She'd inquired about increasing the coverage, asked about payouts in case of violent death, and even researched whether military deaths paid double indemnity. Mrs. Collins, you testified that you loved your husband. Is that why you took out a $2 million life insurance policy on him without his knowledge? I was worried about his safety, Carla replied weakly. Were you worried about his safety when you gave Drew Jenkins the security codes to your house? Drew convinced me Clay was becoming dangerous. Were you worried about his safety when you helped plan the exact time and method of his murder? Carla's composure finally cracked. You don't understand. Clay changed after his deployments. He became cold, distant, paranoid. I was afraid of him. We moved in for the kill. Mrs. Collins, if you were afraid of your husband, why didn't you divorce him? Why didn't you call police? Why didn't you seek help from domestic violence organizations? Why was murder your first and only solution? Carla had no answer. The truth was that Clay had never been abusive, never threatened her, never given her reason to fear for her safety. She'd chosen murder over divorce because murder was more profitable and allowed her to play the grieving widow rather than the cheating wife. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict that would seal Carla's fate. Guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, guilty of attempted murder, guilty of insurance fraud. Under Virginia law, Carla faced the death penalty. Clay watched as his former wife collapsed when the verdict was read, her dreams of freedom and a new life with Drew Jenkins finally ending in the reality of her choices. During the penalty phase, Clay was allowed to address the court. He stood at the victim impact podium and looked directly at the woman who'd shared his bed for 12 years while planning his death. Your Honor, Carla Collins didn't just conspire to end my life. She conspired to destroy everything we'd built together, every memory we'd shared, every moment of trust and intimacy that had defined our marriage. She turned our home into a battlefield, our bedroom into a crime scene, and our wedding vows into lies. The woman I married died the day she decided I was worth more dead than alive. What sits at the defense table is just a stranger who happens to share my name. Clay paused, his eyes never leaving Carla's face. I don't ask for mercy for her, because she showed none for me. I ask for justice, and in this case, justice demands the ultimate penalty for the ultimate betrayal. 3 weeks later, the jury sentenced Carla Collins to death by lethal injection. Chapter 9, the final chapter. 2 years after the trial, Clay Collins stood in his rebuilt home, looking out at the same backyard where 3 criminals had died attempting to murder him. The house had been completely renovated. New flooring, new paint, new furniture that held no memories of his former life. Even the bloodstains were gone, painted over and forgotten by everyone except Clay. Carla remained on death row, her appeals slowly working their way through the federal court system. Clay had been contacted by several reporters wanting to write books about the case, producers interested in making movies, and true crime podcasters seeking interviews. He declined them all. The story was over as far as he was concerned. Drew Jenkins' criminal network had been completely dismantled by federal investigators. Four other military widows came forward to testify about similar approaches from Drew, and two cold cases, military wives who died in apparent home invasions, were reclassified as homicides connected to Drew's conspiracy. Justice had been served for more than just Clay. Clay had retired from active duty and now worked as a private security consultant, helping military families protect themselves from the kind of predators who targeted his marriage. The work was satisfying in a way that his military service had never been. He was preventing tragedies rather than responding to them. On quiet evenings like this one, Clay sometimes wondered if he could have saved his marriage, whether there had been signs he'd missed, warning signals that might have prevented Carla's betrayal. But those thoughts never lasted long. Carla had made her choice when she chose greed over loyalty, murder over honesty, and betrayal over trust. Clay had simply responded to her choice with the skills and determination that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare. His phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Woods. "Collins, thought you should know. Carla's latest appeal was denied. Execution scheduled for next month. You planning to attend?" Clay typed back, "No. She died to me 2 years ago." That was the truth. The woman he'd loved, married, and trusted had ceased to exist the moment she decided to have him killed. What remained on death row was just a collection of memories and regrets wearing Carla's face. Clay deleted the text and poured himself a whiskey, good bourbon, the kind he and Carla used to share during happier times. But the taste held no nostalgia, only the bitter satisfaction of a man who'd survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged victorious. Outside his window, Virginia Beach settled into another peaceful evening. Families sat down to dinner. Couples watched television together. Children played in backyards while their parents watched protectively. Normal lives, built on trust and love rather than conspiracy and murder. Clay had been offered chances to rebuild that kind of life. Several women had expressed interest in the decorated Delta Force operator who'd become famous for surviving his wife's murder plot. But Clay wasn't interested in remarrying. He'd learned that trust, once shattered, could never be fully rebuilt. The next woman who shared his bed might be planning his death, even as she whispered words of love. Some lessons were too expensive to forget, and some betrayals had cut too deep to heal. Clay Collins would live out his remaining years alone, surrounded by security systems and survival skills, trusting no one completely and forgetting nothing. In the end, that was Carla's real legacy, not just her own destruction, but the death of Clay's ability to love without suspicion. She'd murdered more than just their marriage. She'd killed the part of him that believed in unconditional trust between husband and wife. As darkness fell over Virginia Beach, Clay Collins locked his doors, armed his security system, and settled in for another night of dreamless sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new clients to protect, new predators to outmaneuver. But tonight, he was alone with his memories and his bourbon, a survivor in a world where betrayal could come from anyone, even the person lying next to you in bed. The phone buzzed one more time. This time, it was a news alert. Virginia executes Carla Collins for conspiracy to murder husband. Clay read the headline twice, then deleted the message without reading the article. Justice had been served, but it brought no joy, no closure, no sense of victory. It was simply the final period at the end of a story that should never have been written. He raised his glass in a silent toast, not to Carla's death, but to the end of a chapter in his life that had cost him everything he'd once held dear. Then he finished his drink, checked his security system one more time, and went to bed. In the morning, Clay Collins would begin another day as a man who'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that survival sometimes requires becoming something harder and colder than the enemies who seek to destroy you. The woman who'd planned his murder was dead. The man who'd loved her had died with her. What remained was something new, a creature of pure survival instinct, shaped by betrayal and tempered by blood. And Clay Collins was exactly what he needed to be. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen
and I will see you there.